Before I met Molly, my life was a blend of routine and quiet ambition. At 29, I had settled into a stable career at a graphic design firm. My days were filled with creative projects, tight deadlines, and late nights fueled by takeout and too much coffee. Outside of work, I lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of downtown Cincinnati, a space more functional than inviting. My social life was unremarkable, limited to the occasional drink with coworkers or watching Bengals games with my old college roommate, Dave. I hadn't dated seriously in years, still nursing the wounds from a painful breakup. One summer evening, my mother called, urging me to attend a family barbecue. I reluctantly agreed, dreading the inevitable, "Why aren't you married yet?" interrogation from relatives. The event turned out better than expected thanks to my cousin Liz, who introduced me to her best friend's sister, Jenna. Jenna was charming and vivacious, and for a brief moment, I thought I'd met someone who could pull me out of my post-breakup rut. We dated for 3 months, but it fizzled when we realized we were more compatible as friends. Still, the experience planted a seed in me. I realized I was ready to find someone serious. In the months that followed, I made more of an effort to put myself out there. I signed up for a few dating apps, attended social mixers, and even let my coworkers set me up on blind dates. But none of it felt right. The women I met were wonderful in their own ways, but the spark I was looking for never came. That's when I started spending more time alone, convinced that love might not be in the cards for me. Yet, despite my cynicism, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just around the corner. The night I met Molly was unremarkable at first. I had stopped at the grocery store after work to pick up some essentials, milk, bread, and a frozen pizza. As I browsed the tea aisle, debating whether to splurge on a new blend, a woman's voice broke through my thoughts. "Excuse me," she said. "Could you help me grab that box up there? I can't quite reach it." Turning, I saw her. A petite woman with a dazzling smile and striking black hair. She seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen her before. After handing her the tea, we struck up a conversation. She joked about being vertically challenged at 5'7" and teased me about my overly serious expression as I shopped. By the time we parted ways, she had slipped me her number, written hastily on the back of a receipt. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but smile. Something about Molly was different. She had an effortless charm, a way of making you feel like the only person in the room. Our first date was a whirlwind of laughter and shared stories. Over dinner at a small Italian bistro, Molly's warmth and wit left me captivated. By the end of the evening, I was already thinking about our next date. But as much as I was falling for her, I couldn't shake a nagging thought. Why did she seem so familiar? It wasn't until months later that I learned Molly had orchestrated our meeting at the grocery store. She had seen me there before and decided to accidentally bump into me that night. At the time, I found the revelation endearing, proof of her boldness and determination. I had no idea then how deeply she and her sisters would intertwine my life with theirs. You might judge me as utterly oblivious, perhaps the most trusting and naive husband to walk this earth. But in my defense, clarity often comes with hindsight, revealing truths we miss in the moment. Like any contentedly married man, I cherished and trusted my wife completely. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that the woman I loved for 8 years, someone with whom I shared countless tender moments and wonderful memories, could be so selfishly deceptive. Yet, not only was she, her 2 sisters were equally complicit. From the outset of our relationship, Molly's 2 sisters were fixtures in her life, and soon enough, in mine. Encountering identical triplets was both uncanny and exhilarating. 3 stunning women who looked exactly alike. When Molly and I met at a grocery store, she approached me for help retrieving some tea from a high shelf. At the time, I thought it was a serendipitous encounter, but it turned out to be far more orchestrated than I initially realized. Molly, at 5'7", had a curvy, voluptuous figure and short jet black hair framing her face. I'm taller, about 6 feet, so it made sense she turned to me for assistance. Little did I know that she had been watching me from the produce section, waiting for the perfect moment to strike up a conversation. She later confessed, during a tender moment after we first slept together, that she had orchestrated the entire encounter. I'll admit, it was a flattering revelation. Our first few dates felt like something out of a romantic movie. We dined at cozy restaurants, stayed out late talking, strolled through the park feeding ducks, and even held hands through an incredibly cheesy rom-com. Corny as it sounds, I was mesmerized. Molly was the most captivating woman I'd ever met. wholesome yet sexy, with a smile that could charm even the coldest IRS auditor. That first encounter at her apartment, however, caught me completely off guard. As I rang the doorbell, it wasn't Molly who greeted me, but a woman who looked exactly like her. "Hi, you must be Scott," she said, flashing the same dazzling smile Molly had. I stammered, "Wait, you're not Molly." With a laugh, she replied, "Nope, I'm Hannah. Didn't Molly tell you about us? We're triplets." Still trying to wrap my head around the situation, I shook my head. Not really." "She does that sometimes, just to mess with people," Hannah said with a playful grin. "Come on in. I'll go get her." Inside, I saw yet another Molly lookalike lounging on the couch, who turned out to be Amy. They were indistinguishable from Molly. Same haircut, same physique, same radiant smiles. It wasn't until Molly finally appeared that I could relax. "Hi, Scott," she said, grinning mischievously. "Would you like some herbal tea?" Over our first dinner, we delved into every imaginable topic, but I was especially curious about what it was like to grow up as a triplet. I asked her how it felt to see two identical faces every day, if they were closer than most siblings, and whether they had ever pulled pranks by pretending to be one another. Molly admitted with a grin that they'd had plenty of fun fooling people over the years. When we were kids, even our parents couldn't tell us apart. We used to switch places all the time, especially if one of us was in trouble. If Amy was about to get punished, she'd beg me to pretend to be her. It drove our dad crazy. She went on to share more stories, including one about stepping in for Amy on a first date when Amy was sick, only for Amy to carry on the relationship afterward without the guy ever finding out. At the time, I thought the story was charming. In retrospect, it should have been a warning. Molly and her sisters had an incredibly close bond. After college, they all moved back to Cincinnati and rented a shared apartment. That's where I first met the other two. Fast forward 8 years. Molly and I had fallen deeply in love, gotten married after 2 years of dating, and settled into a seemingly idyllic life. I had a solid job at a graphic design firm, making good money, and we owned a comfortable 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a short drive from downtown. And wouldn't you know it, Molly's sisters lived close by. Amy married Ted, a quiet, unremarkable finance guy, and they moved into a house right next door. Hannah married Arnold, a boisterous, cigar-smoking bowling alley owner with a great sense of humor, and they lived just behind us on Oak Park Place. The triplets were inseparable, and their nightly chats in one of our kitchens became a staple of our lives. Even after years of marriage, it was still hard to tell them apart at a glance. Ted, Arnie, and I often relied on their outfits or jewelry to avoid mixing them up. Little did I know that close bond between the sisters would eventually lead to my undoing. At the time, though, I felt like the luckiest man alive, utterly devoted to Molly, and oblivious to what was really happening. Spending Christmas with Pam and Donald, Molly's parents, revealed that even they had trouble telling their daughters apart, just like the rest of us. However, their similarities in appearance didn't extend to their personalities. Amy was the reserved one, tough, a bit prim, and more traditional than her sisters. Hannah, on the other hand, was the wild child. She loved a good drink, told risque jokes, and had a carefree energy that could make you wonder if she'd ever tried her hand at exotic dancing, though I doubt she actually did. Molly was the happy medium, balanced between Amy's seriousness and Hannah's reckless streak. To me, she was just right. She had a sweet and outgoing nature, but she also kept her head on straight. It wasn't that their personalities didn't shine through when we spent time together. The problem was you could never tell which sister you were dealing with just by looking or listening. And if they decided to fool you, you didn't stand a chance. Vacation planning was a breeze back then since none of us had kids yet. As you might expect, Molly and her sisters insisted on group vacations. Every summer, the 6 of us would take a 2-week trip somewhere exciting, whether it was Las Vegas, a beach in North Carolina, or even Italy. For a while, we all got along well enough that the husbands didn't mind tagging along. Still, I made one thing clear. I needed 1 week a year for just Molly and me. No sisters, no brothers-in-law. Initially, this demand caused quite a bit of tension. Molly was furious at the idea of leaving her sisters out, and we had more than a few arguments. It took 3 years of me standing my ground for her to finally accept the arrangement. "I love your sisters, and I enjoy spending time with Arnie and Ted," I told her one day, "but I also need time that's just ours. Is that so hard to understand? Here's the deal. We do a 2-week group trip every year, but I get 1 week with you, just the 2 of us." I must have delivered that speech at least 10 times before it stuck. The turning point came the day before our trip to Italy. Molly came home from work and saw that I hadn't even started packing. That led to yet another heated argument during which I calmly told her I wasn't going unless she agreed to a solo trip with me later. Her frustration boiled over, and after what felt like hours of yelling, phone calls to her sisters, and failed attempts to change my mind, she finally relented. The first few days in Italy were icy, with Molly's sisters making it clear they thought I was the villain of the story. But thanks to Arnie and Ted, who quietly celebrated my victory because it gave them leverage for similar requests, I didn't back down. By the 5th day, Florence had worked its magic on Molly, and we ended up having an unforgettable trip. That winter, we spent a romantic week on Sanibel Island, and after that, our travel routine became a happy compromise. 2 weeks with the group and 1 week just for us. At that point, life seemed pretty idyllic, but everything changed when we started trying for a baby. For years, Molly and I had talked about having kids someday, but we were in no rush. We were enjoying our child-free lifestyle too much. However, when Molly and her sisters turned 30, the clock started ticking. She stopped taking birth control, and within a few months, we were actively trying to conceive. I had no complaints, both about the goal and the process of getting there. Our bed life had always been wonderful, full of tenderness and closeness. We had our favorite positions, and while we occasionally got adventurous, most nights were more about loving connection than wild passion. Every once in a while, though, Molly would surprise me, coming to bed with an unusually fiery energy that led to long nights of passionate sex. Special occasions like birthdays and anniversaries often included champagne, which only heightened her excitement. Those moments, while not frequent, were always memorable. One Saturday evening, after an especially intense session, I jokingly said something that I didn't realize would strike such a nerve. I had just returned from the grocery store to find Molly lying without clothes on the bed, a bottle of massage oil in hand. "I'm feeling stressed today," she murmured with a playful smile. "Think you can help me out, cowboy?" What followed was one of the most sensual nights of our marriage. After an incredible massage, I brought her to climax multiple times before we had passionate, mind-blowing sex. We spent hours wrapped in each other's arms, taking breaks only to snack on the food Molly fetched from the kitchen. As we lay together, basking in the afterglow, I jokingly said, "Wow, that was something else. Or wait, maybe you're not Molly. Maybe I just got lucky with Amy or Hannah tonight. I don't think Molly's ever been this enthusiastic." I meant it as a lighthearted tease, but the moment the words left my mouth, I realized I'd hit a nerve. Molly's expression turned icy. "That's not funny, Scott," she said sharply. "How could you even joke about something like that? Do you really think I'd ever share you with my sisters?" Her reaction was so intense that I immediately backpedaled. "Molly, I was just kidding, honey. I'd never actually think that." I reached for her, but she pulled away, grabbed her robe, and went to take a shower, locking the door behind her. The rest of the night and most of the next day were frosty. Molly barely acknowledged me, making it clear that this was not a subject for jokes. By Sunday evening, I apologized again at dinner, emphasizing that it was meant as a harmless joke. She softened a little, letting me hold her in bed that night. But I made a mental note: never joke about switching sisters again. Her reaction, though extreme, left me puzzled, and if I'm honest, a little uneasy. On our first date, Molly shared a quirky story about standing in for her sister Amy on a date with a boy in high school. It seemed funny and harmless at the time, a charming anecdote from her youth. A few weeks before our wedding, the subject came up again during a lighthearted argument over which hotel we should book for our honeymoon in Curacao. Molly wanted one place, I preferred another, and eventually I caved to her choice. But in the midst of our playful debate, I jokingly said, "Maybe I'll just marry one of your sisters instead if you keep being so stubborn." She didn't miss a beat, smirking as she replied, "Good luck with that, baby. Amy and Hannah know all about your snoring. Hard pass. You're stuck with me." I laughed. "Fine, if they don't want me, I guess I'll settle for you." And that was the end of it, or so I thought. It never crossed my mind that years later, a similar joke would provoke such a different reaction. But none of that mattered at the time. What truly upended my life was what happened later, during our struggle to start a family. Molly and I had always planned to have kids, but we weren't in any rush. For years, we enjoyed our time as a carefree couple, with no obligations beyond each other and our circle of family and friends. When Molly turned 30 and I was 32, she decided it was time. She stopped taking birth control, and within a few months we were trying. While I found the process enjoyable, Molly grew increasingly anxious as month after month passed without success. After 10 months, she suggested I get tested. I wasn't concerned. Plenty of couples take longer than that to conceive, but I agreed. The experience wasn't exactly fun. Sitting in a small clinical room with a stack of outdated adult magazines wasn't what I'd call ideal. Still, I did what needed to be done. A few days later, the results came in. On Friday afternoon, while I was at work, I got a call from Dr. Rendell. Closing my office door, I listened as he explained, "Scott, there's no need to worry. Your seed count is slightly below average, about 70% of what's typical for a man your age. But the good news is that the seed you do have are healthy and strong. It may take a bit longer than usual, but there's no reason you and Molly shouldn't be able to conceive." Relieved, I planned to tell Molly the good news that evening to ease her mind. But somehow, it slipped my thoughts during dinner as we got caught up in a discussion about local politics. The evening passed uneventfully, and it wasn't until I was lying in bed around 11 p.m. that I remembered. I decided to head downstairs and tell her right away, even if it meant interrupting her usual late-night chat with her sisters in the kitchen. As I walked through the living room, I heard bursts of laughter coming from the kitchen. Curious and amused by their boisterous energy, I paused outside the door, hesitating before stepping in. For no particular reason other than curiosity, I lingered, eavesdropping on their conversation. The first voice, which I recognized as Amy's, said, "If he's not your favorite, why do you always want to switch nights with me?" Another voice, likely Hannah's, giggled, "I never said Arnie wasn't great. I just said he's not as good at, certain things as Scott is." The third voice chimed in, "Besides, you get Arnie more nights a week than either of us. And weekends too. Stop complaining." Laughter followed, and my stomach sank. At first, I didn't understand what they were talking about. Then, as I listened in shock, the conversation took a turn that made my blood run cold. Amy, or maybe it was Hannah, said, "It's been almost a year. If Molly hasn't gotten pregnant yet, it must be Scott's fault." "So, what's the backup plan?" came another voice. "It's simple," Molly replied matter-of-factly. "If the test results aren't good, I'll just spend a few nights with Ted during my fertile window. Scott and Ted are similar enough, same build, same coloring. No one would ever know. After all, it's a little boring being with Scott every night anyway. Once the cycle's over, and I know it's safe, I can switch back to Arnie for some fun." Someone protested, "You're not getting Arnie again until this is sorted. That's not up for debate." Their laughter filled the air again, but I stood frozen, unable to process what I just heard. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't believe what they were suggesting. Molly was planning to have another man father her child while keeping me in the dark. I felt my chest tighten as the reality of their words hit me. My marriage, what I thought was a happy, loving partnership, suddenly felt like a cruel lie. I quietly backed away, retreating to the darkness of the living room where I sat in stunned silence, trying to piece together what to do next. When the noise in the kitchen began to die down, I slipped back into bed, pretending to be asleep. Moments later, I felt someone slide under the covers beside me. She leaned over, kissed my cheek softly, and whispered, "I love you, baby." It was Molly, or at least I thought it was. Every instinct in me screamed to confront her right then and there. I wanted to shout, accuse, demand answers, but instead I lay there, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep as my mind raced with questions and plans. I waited for her breathing to slow and deepen before I carefully slipped out of bed, ready to start figuring out what to do about the wreckage of my life. It didn't take long to figure out how they could pull this off. Swapping partners for Zex wouldn't be complicated at all. The sisters met almost every night, and they could easily change clothes during their kitchen gatherings. Since all three of them worked part-time as co-managers at the same interior design store, they didn't leave for work until after Arnie, Ted, and I had gone. Switching back in the morning would be just as easy. Weekends might be trickier, but still manageable. We spent almost every Saturday together as a group, barbecues, dinners, or casual hangouts. A quick visit to one of the sisters' houses for some pretext, like grabbing a catalog or borrowing something, could serve as an opportunity for the switch. No, the logistics weren't the mystery. What I couldn't wrap my head around was the why. Surely we husbands would have noticed something, right? How could you not tell your own wife apart from someone else? But the truth was, none of us had any reason to be suspicious. I certainly didn't. It had never even crossed my mind to doubt the identity of the woman in my bed. Looking back, though, something had changed in our marriage. Early on, Molly and I had loved lying in bed at night, talking about everything, our dreams, plans, and even mundane things about our day. Sometimes these conversations replaced or followed Zex. But somewhere along the way, that closeness faded. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but Molly began brushing off my attempts to talk at night. She would come to bed late after spending time with her sisters, and any effort I made to start a conversation was met with, "I'm too tired, honey. Let's talk tomorrow." Over time, all the meaningful discussions we used to have moved to earlier in the day, during dinner or in the early evening. I realized this was probably intentional. If the sisters were swapping husbands, avoiding deeper conversations in bed reduced the risk of one of them accidentally revealing a gap in knowledge or slipping up on a shared memory. That night, after Molly had fallen asleep, I went to the office and found the ink pad we used for stamping checks. Carefully, I dabbed a tiny amount of black ink on my finger and returned to the bedroom. With steady hands, I marked a small spot on Molly's back, just below her shoulder blade. It was no larger than the head of a pencil eraser, small enough that she wouldn't notice unless she happened to examine her back in the mirror. Afterward, I washed my hands thoroughly in the bathroom, scrubbing with soap and a pumice stone until the ink stain was faint enough to be invisible. Sliding back into bed, I lay there grimly, contemplating my next steps. The initial shock of what I'd overheard had dulled, replaced by a simmering anger. If what I'd understood from their conversation was true, Molly had been betraying me. Deeply and systematically, perhaps for years. She and her sisters had prioritized their bond over the loyalty and love they owed their husbands. I felt used, humiliated, and profoundly deceived. The next day, we gathered at Ted's house for a barbecue. While the women were inside preparing the food, I saw my chance to speak with Arnie privately. Ted was preoccupied at the grill, so I turned to Arnie and asked, "Do you feel like taking a quick walk around the block?" Arnie, always keen to stay active, smiled and nodded. "Sure, let's do it." As we strolled out of earshot from the others, I decided to ease into the topic. "Arnie," I said, breaking the silence, "do you mind if I ask you something personal? It'll only take a couple of minutes." He glanced at me curiously, but answered without hesitation. "Of course, Scott. What's on your mind?" "First, let's agree this stays between us," I said. "I don't want the women, or Ted for that matter, knowing we talked about this. If anyone asks, let's say we were brainstorming about a possible trip to Greece next summer." Arnie chuckled. "Got it. My lips are sealed." I hesitated, then said, "This is a bit embarrassing, but I wanted to ask about your, bed life with Hannah. Molly and I are intimate about once or twice a week, and sometimes I wish it were more. Do you think her sisters are the same way?" Arnie laughed heartily and clapped me on the back. "Oh, buddy, sounds like you drew the short straw. Hannah and I are at it practically every night. We might skip a night if she's on her period or we're exhausted, but other than that, it's like clockwork." He grinned at my expression. "I guess I got lucky, huh? Not that any of us could have known. It's not like we got to compare notes before marrying them." I forced a weak smile, masking the rage bubbling beneath the surface. "I guess so. Has it always been like that? Since the beginning of your marriage?" He thought for a moment. "Pretty much. We've got this little routine, you know. Every night after she comes back from hanging out with her sisters, she walks into the bedroom and gives me this look. Then, in her best sultry voice, she says, 'Well, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' I tell her what I'm in the mood for, and we go from there. It might sound silly, but I'm not complaining." He chuckled again, clearly amused. I nodded, feigning mild disappointment. "One more question. Molly and I used to have long talks in bed. We'd talk about our relationship, our future, that sort of thing. But lately the bedroom's just for Zex and sleep. No more late-night talks. Is Hannah like that too?" "Yeah, we're the same way," Arnie replied. "I think the girls save the meaningful stuff for earlier in the day. Doesn't bother me, though. By the time we hit the bed, it's all about winding down, or, winding up." He laughed at his own joke, but I barely heard it. My suspicions were growing stronger by the second, and I couldn't ignore the pieces falling into place. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was already planning my next move. As Arnie and I walked back to the house, he chatted enthusiastically about his beloved Cincinnati Bengals, his passion second only to his love for Hannah. I tried to respond with the occasional, "Oh, really?" or "That's interesting," but my thoughts were far from football. My mind felt trapped in a cold, desolate place, and beneath the surface I was boiling with anger. I managed to make it through the entire afternoon and evening without letting my emotions spill over. People noticed I was a bit withdrawn, but I stayed composed, determined to get through the day. After we left Ted and Amy's house, I even took Molly out for Indian food, her favorite, and spent the evening pretending to be the cheerful, devoted husband. Around 10 p.m., Molly joined her sisters for their usual late-night gathering. When she returned and we started getting ready for bed, I walked up behind her and gently ran my fingers over her shoulders and back, casually searching for the ink mark I'd placed the night before. It wasn't there. All right, I thought to myself grimly. The game's up. Whoever you are, it's time for you and your sisters to face the consequences. I kept my tone light as I asked, "Honey, how's that scratch on your leg? Let me take a look." She froze for just a moment before replying cautiously, "Scratch? What scratch?" I feigned surprise. "The one you got yesterday after dinner when you bumped into the dishwasher door. Don't you remember?" "Oh, right. This?" she said with forced casualness, glancing down at her leg. "It's completely fine now. Barely a mark left." Yeah, I guess you're right," I said, pretending to inspect her leg. "Wow, it healed fast. Yesterday, it looked pretty bad." I stood up and caught the barely perceptible sigh of relief as she turned away. I headed to the bathroom to brush my teeth, smiling to myself. There was no scratch, and her reaction confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't Molly. A few minutes later, I was lying in bed when she emerged from the bathroom. "Hey, honey," I said casually. "Let's pick up where we left off last night. That was incredible." She hesitated, her expression uncertain. "What do you mean?" "You know, last night," I said with a playful grin. "You came downstairs with that sparkle in your eye and said, 'So, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' And then you pushed me onto the bed and, well, you remember, you were wild. It was unforgettable." Her face froze for a moment before she forced a smile. "Of course I remember," she said, trying to sound convincing. "But I don't think I'm up for anything that energetic tonight." I nodded sympathetically. "That's okay. We can take it slow and easy. But tell me those things you said to me last night. I loved hearing them." She slid into bed and immediately embraced me, hiding her face against my chest. "Sure, baby," she murmured. "Whatever you want. What did you like the most?" I chuckled softly. "Oh, everything you said while we were in the middle of it." As we began to touch and kiss, I couldn't help but notice how different she seemed. Despite my efforts, she wasn't responding the way Molly usually did. Her body was stiff, her reactions hesitant. Finally, I pulled back and asked innocently, "Are you okay, sweetheart? You don't seem like yourself tonight." She gave me a tight smile. "Sorry, Scott. I think it's the spicy food. It's upsetting my stomach. Let's keep it simple tonight, okay?" I nodded understandingly. "Of course, Molly. We can take it easy. Let's just keep it soft and loving." What followed was perfectly ordinary routine sex. Nothing passionate, nothing remarkable, just the kind of polite closeness that happens in long-term marriages. But as we lay there afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sharing my bed with a stranger. The next day, Sunday, was when everything started to unravel. The six of us had brunch reservations at Trentino's, a favorite downtown spot, before heading to Arnie and Hannah's house for the afternoon. Over Eggs Benedict and Belgian waffles, I made sure Molly didn't have the chance to sneak off and warn her sisters. I knew she was furious, likely blaming whoever had been in my bed on Friday for failing to give her the necessary details. It didn't take long for the tension to show. Not 10 seconds after the waiter took our drink orders, Molly turned to Hannah with a sharp look and said, "Hannah, I need to use the restroom. Can you join me?" The two of them disappeared, Molly looking irritated, Hannah confused. When they returned, both looked pale and unsettled. They fumbled with their drinks and seemed unable to follow the conversation. Occasionally, they exchanged nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. Amy, initially oblivious to the tension, eventually picked up on the mood. She didn't know what was wrong, but she could tell something was off. A few minutes later, she leaned over to Hannah and said, "Honey, my contact lens is bothering me. Can you come help me adjust it?" When they returned, all three sisters looked visibly anxious. They avoided eye contact with me and barely participated in the conversation. Their unease continued throughout the day, much to my satisfaction. While the men watched the Bengals game, the sisters retreated to the back of the house. For hours, we didn't hear a peep from them. By the time we were ready to leave, Hannah and Amy could barely meet my eyes when saying goodbye. It was clear my little experiment had worked. Whatever game they'd been playing, they were now scrambling to figure out how much I knew and how much I was willing to do about it. Dinner at home that night was a strained, silent affair. I made an effort to keep up appearances, sharing amusing stories about work or chatting about our vacation plans for the year. Molly, however, barely managed a weak smile, offering only the occasional monosyllabic response. Her fear was palpable, and I could see it in her every movement. Despite my outward cheerfulness, I watched her closely, noting the unease in her eyes. Later, around 9:15 p.m., Molly said tentatively, "Honey, I think I'll go see Hannah for a little while, okay?" "Sure," I replied casually. "While you're gone, I'll probably start packing up my things. I'll load them into the car tonight and figure out a truck for the furniture later this week." Her face turned ashen. "What are you talking about, Scott? Why would you need to pack your things?" Without missing a beat, I replied, "Because I'm leaving. Did you really think I'd stay in this house, living with a lying, cheating woman?" She gasped, visibly shaken. "Scott, I don't understand." I cut her off with a cold glare. "Oh, you understand. You just don't know what to say next." I turned toward the stairs, adding, "See you when you get back." "Scott, wait," she cried, her voice trembling. But I ignored her and went upstairs to pack. I expected her first reaction would be to call her sisters for reinforcements, and I was right. Within minutes, Molly appeared in the bedroom doorway, tear-streaked and looking utterly distraught. "Scott, Amy and Hannah are here. Could you come downstairs and talk to us?" I glanced at her briefly. Her makeup was smudged, and she looked miserable. So much so that for a fleeting moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'll be down in a minute," I said evenly. Before leaving, I found my small digital voice recorder, something I often used for dictation notes. I set it to record, slipped it into my pocket, and went downstairs. In the kitchen, all three sisters sat at the table, their faces tight with anxiety. I pulled out a chair and sat across from them, scanning their expressions. "Well?" I prompted. The silence stretched painfully as none of them wanted to speak first. Finally, Molly broke it. "Scott, you know how much I love you, don't you?" I gave her a cold, hard stare. "Sorry, which sister are you?" She snapped. "I'm Molly. I'm your wife." "Oh, really?" I said, standing. "Let's confirm that." I walked behind her and checked her back. No mark. Then I inspected the other two. There it was, clear as day, on Amy's shoulder blade. Their confusion was evident as I sat back down. "All right," I said calmly. "Let's assume for a moment you are Molly. Then tell me, where were you Friday night?" "Because your sister," I gestured toward Amy, "was in my bed." They froze, staring at me in stunned silence. "Take your time," I said, leaning back. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why at least two of you, if not all three, have been taking turns sleeping with me." Molly began sobbing, her tears falling freely, while Amy and Hannah sat grim-faced, avoiding my gaze. I stood, pretending to leave. "I should get back to packing." "No, wait!" Molly cried desperately. "I'll explain. Just please, Scott, give me a chance to explain." I paused, deciding to hear what they had to say. Part of me wanted to scream that it was too late for explanations, but curiosity got the better of me. What excuse could they possibly come up with for this insanity? Molly's sobs made her unable to speak, so Hannah hesitantly stepped in. "It started as a joke," she said quietly. "A stupid, stupid game that got out of hand." "A game?" I repeated, my voice icy. "Go on." Hannah swallowed hard. "About a month ago, we were joking about each other's husbands. What we liked, what we didn't. The conversation turned to, Zex. One thing led to another, and someone joked about switching partners. Like a dare. It was supposed to be just talk, but then it escalated." She hesitated, looking nervously at her sisters before continuing. "On Friday night, we decided to actually go through with it. We swapped clothes in the kitchen, and then we went to each other's houses. I was with Ted, Amy was with you, and Molly was with Arnie. On Saturday, we switched again for the barbecue." "It was stupid," Hannah added quickly. "We all realize that now. We're sorry, Scott. Molly loves you so much. Can't you see how upset she is?" Molly continued to sob as Hannah gestured toward her, but I wasn't moved. "So," I said slowly, "Amy was with me and Molly was with Arnie?" They nodded reluctantly. I turned to Amy. "How was it, Amy? How does being with me compare to being with Ted?" Amy's face flushed crimson. I don't know, Scott." "Oh, come on. Was it good? Memorable? Let's relive it together. What exactly did we do?" She stammered, "I don't remember." "You don't remember?" I asked incredulously. "It was 2 nights ago. You swapped husbands for the first time in your life, and you can't recall what happened? Are you suffering from amnesia?" I turned back to Hannah. "Nice story, Hannah, but it's complete garbage. Yes, Amy was in my bed Friday night. I marked her with ink to prove it. But we didn't have Zex. And don't insult me by pretending this was the first time. Do you think I don't know that you three share Arnie on rotation while I get scraps?" They gasped, but I pressed on. You think I don't know that Arnie gets one of you every night while I'm lucky to get Molly once or twice a week? Congratulations, ladies. You've perfected your little game. But don't expect me to play along anymore. Their stunned silence said everything I needed to know. I paused to gauge their reaction. Molly was sobbing uncontrollably, while her sisters sat in grim silence. My patience was wearing thin, but I wanted the truth out in the open. I'll give you one more chance, I said coldly. Molly, this time I want to hear it from you. How long have you been cheating on me? With their husbands? Molly's tear-streaked face turned toward me, pleading, but she couldn't hold my gaze. The room was thick with silence until she finally lowered her eyes to the table. It's been years, she admitted quietly, since Hannah and Arnie's wedding. Another heavy pause. Then Hannah spoke. Scott, it wasn't her idea. Amy and I pressured her into it. Molly quickly chimed in. It wasn't often, Scott, just a couple of times a year at first. I let out a bitter laugh. At first, I repeated. And then what? Let me guess. A couple of times a year turned into a regular arrangement, didn't it? Amy hesitated, before nodding reluctantly. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice razor sharp. The three of you passed around your husbands like some twisted game of musical chairs. Is that about right, Molly? She nodded again, her face a picture of misery. And when did that evolve into Arnie getting 7 nights a week while I got scraps? Molly didn't answer, staring at the floor. How many nights a week, Molly? How often were you with Arnie? I pressed. Her voice was barely audible. 1 or 2. Wonderful, I said sarcastically. I'd heard enough. It was just sex, Molly stammered, her voice trembling. It had nothing to do with love, Scott. Nothing to do with what we have. Nothing to do with love, I repeated mockingly. And I suppose it had nothing to do with trying to get pregnant with Ted's child either? Her breath hitched and her sisters exchanged uneasy glances. Scott, that's not true, she said, standing and trying to approach me. I stood abruptly, pushing her back. She stumbled into the refrigerator, tears streaming down her face. Don't touch me, I spat. You've betrayed me in every conceivable way with the help of your 2 scheming sisters. Go ahead, share Arnie and Ted between you. Maybe you can add someone else to your collection. Without giving them a chance to respond, I stormed out of the kitchen, grabbed my suitcase, and left the house. As I walked out the door, I could still hear muffled sobs coming from the kitchen. That night, I tossed and turned in a sterile hotel room, my anger keeping sleep at bay. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I took the day off work, visited a lawyer, and closed joint accounts at the bank. Then I arranged a lunch meeting with Arnie and Ted, insisting it was urgent enough for Ted to cancel a meeting. When we sat down in a booth at the diner, I didn't waste time. Gentlemen, I said, I have something to tell you, and I don't know how to make it sound less insane. Our wives have been sleeping with each other's husbands for years. Arnie looked shell-shocked, but Ted simply nodded, his expression grim. I've had my suspicions, he admitted. Arnie and I stared at him. You suspected this? I asked incredulously. Ted shrugged. There were too many little things that didn't add up. Amy would forget conversations we had the night before, or she'd act strangely, like she was covering something up. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, so I started keeping track. I thought if I ever got solid evidence, I'd bring it to you too. How did you find out? I recounted the conversation I'd overheard, the ink mark, and the confrontation with the sisters. Ted listened intently while Arnie repeatedly muttered, This is unbelievable. I recorded last night's conversation, I added, pulling out the voice recorder. Here, listen for yourselves. They sat in stunned silence as the recording played, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. When it ended, none of us spoke for a long moment. Then Arnie said softly, What now? I'm divorcing Molly, I said firmly. There's no going back from this. Ted and Arnie weren't sure yet what they would do, but we spent hours talking. Ironically, it was the closest I'd ever felt to either of them. Despite everything, I realized I'd miss them when this was over. By the end of the week, I'd found an apartment and moved my things out of the house. Molly called me incessantly, both at work and on my cell. I instructed my assistant to block her calls and got a new phone number. I made sure my apartment's number was unlisted, severing all contact. That Thursday, I had an unexpected conversation with Barbara, a colleague. She noticed my distracted mood at work and asked what was wrong. I ended up sharing the story, and as I spoke, her face showed a mix of shock, sympathy, and something else. Something almost gleeful. Her reaction irritated me. What's so funny about this, Barbara? I asked. She flushed. I'm not laughing, Scott. It's just, I'm sorry. This isn't the time to say it. Say what? I pressed. Well, she said hesitantly, I've always thought we'd make a good couple. You're a great guy, and I've admired you for a while. Her words left me speechless. Barbara was beautiful, funny, and kind, something I'd always known in the back of my mind but had never dwelled on because of my love for Molly. Now, though, the idea seemed worth considering. We talked more that day, careful not to let anyone at the office notice. But by the time we parted, I knew I was seeing Barbara in a completely different light. Through my lawyer, Molly begged for a chance to meet with me and explain everything. I was certain she couldn't say anything to change my mind, but I agreed to meet her anyway, just to hear what she had to say. My instincts were right. We met in the conference room of my lawyer's office about 6 weeks after I moved out. I arrived first, sitting and waiting as she walked in. Despite her sadness, she was still strikingly beautiful. I watched as she sat down across from me, her expression a mixture of regret and fear. So, Molly, I began evenly, how are you doing? Pregnant with Ted's baby yet? Her face flushed with embarrassment. No, Scott, she replied. I'm not with Ted or anyone else. I would never try to get pregnant with anyone but you. I leaned back in my chair. Funny thing, I said. The night I overheard your little kitchen conversation, I was about to tell you that Dr. Randall said my seed were fine. A bit below average, sure, but strong enough to make a baby. No need for Ted to step in as a substitute. Not that it really matters. You've been sleeping with him and Arnie for years anyway. Tears welled up in her eyes. Scott, please, she pleaded. Let me explain. Explain? I shot back, my voice sharp. Explain how sorry you are, how terrible you feel. Do you honestly think you feel worse than I do? She shook her head silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Fine, I said with a heavy sigh. Go ahead. But do me a favor. Spare me the talk about how much you love me or how this had nothing to do with us. I've heard enough of that nonsense. Scott, she began softly, it really didn't have anything to do with you. It was, I don't know, a stupid, crazy thing Hannah, Amy, and I started. It's always been our thing since high school, a game. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. A game? I asked, incredulous. So you've done this with all your boyfriends? She hesitated before nodding. Almost all of them. My sisters and I were always so close and sharing everything. Clothes, gossip, even boyfriends felt natural. It brought us closer. I stayed quiet, letting her continue. When we got married, I thought it would stop. And it did, for a while. I narrowed my eyes. Hold on. Did your sister sleep with me while we were dating? She blushed deeply. Yes, 2 or 3 times. I didn't want to, especially when I realized how serious we were getting, but it had always been our way. They pushed me into it. Well, I said bitterly, I guess I passed the test, considering you married me. She didn't respond. Molly, I continued, my voice rising, you don't get it, do you? You used me. You and your sisters turned me into a toy for your amusement. And for what? Because Arnie was better in bed? Did you ever stop to think about how any of this might make me feel? Actually, don't answer that. I don't want to hear it. Her lips trembled. Scott, I know it was awful, but you need to understand. You've slept with all 3 of us, too. But I didn't know that, you idiot, I snapped. Don't you get it? Even if we had agreed to some kind of partner-swapping arrangement, which I never would have, I would at least have been aware. I would have experienced the thrill of something new. But I didn't know. For me, it was always you. Not anyone else. Just the woman I loved more than anything. I stood abruptly, pacing the room. Here's the truth, Molly. I was your husband. You should have put me first. Our marriage should have been your priority, but it wasn't. You chose your sisters over me. You chose Zex with Arnie over me. You even planned to have Ted's baby without telling me. And now you can have them, but you'll never have me again. I'm done. She broke into sobs as I headed for the door. Scott, please, she cried. I don't need my sisters. I need you. I stopped, turning to face her one last time. That's convenient, I said coldly. After all these years, you finally decided to pick me. But here's the thing. It's no longer your choice. It's mine. And I choose to live without the woman who lied to me, betrayed me, and made me a fool for years. Have a nice life. Her wails echoed in the room as I walked out. Strangely, as I left, I felt a sense of clarity. Life suddenly seemed a little lighter. A few weeks later, Barbara and I started seeing each other. After our 3rd date, I realized something I hadn't expected. There were other women in the world besides Molly and her sisters, and I could enjoy sex with them. Barbara was energetic and enthusiastic, and our first night together turned into an entire weekend of passion. It was hot, fun, and exactly what I needed, though I wasn't sure if it would lead to anything serious. For now, it was enough. Barbara seemed to understand my confusion. She didn't push for anything more, giving me the space I needed. I appreciated that more than I could say. Arnie decided to stay with Hannah, which didn't surprise me. He was their favorite after all, and the revelations didn't seem to hit him as hard as they did Ted and me. Still, he made it clear to Hannah that he was in charge now. She had to grow her hair long so she could never switch with her sisters again without his permission, and he warned her that if she betrayed him even once, she'd be out on the street with nothing. Ted, on the other hand, hit Amy where it hurt most. He got a job offer in Chicago and told her, "I'm moving in 3 weeks. You can come with me and we can try counseling, or you can stay here with your sisters. It's up to you." Amy was torn. She couldn't bear to lose Ted, but she also couldn't imagine life without her sisters. I didn't care which she chose. In my mind, they all deserved what they got. Good riddance to the three of them. After leaving Molly and her tangled web of betrayal behind, I found myself grappling with the wreckage of my life. Despite the clarity of my decision, the days following my departure were heavy with anger, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just Molly I'd left behind. It was a vision of the future I had clung to for nearly a decade. The love we had shared, the plans we made, and the life we built together were now ashes, swept away by her deceit. At first, I threw myself into work. My graphic design firm became a sanctuary, a space where the hum of creativity drowned out the echoes of Molly's sobbing pleas. I began taking on additional projects, staying late at the office not out of necessity but to avoid the deafening silence of my empty apartment. My coworkers noticed my fervor, though I didn't share the reason behind it. I preferred their admiration for my work ethic over their pity for my personal life. Barbara, on the other hand, became an unexpected source of solace. Our conversations, initially light and filled with cautious flirtation, began to deepen as we spent more time together. She was empathetic without being intrusive, her laughter a balm to the raw wounds left by Molly's betrayal. I found myself looking forward to her company, a lightness returning to my days that I hadn't felt in years. Yet, rebuilding wasn't linear. There were nights when I lay awake, haunted by memories of Molly and her sisters. I couldn't help but replay every moment, dissecting their words, their actions, trying to understand how I had been so blind. Anger would flare up, hot and suffocating, followed by a hollow sadness that left me feeling adrift. Therapy helped me make sense of my emotions, though I initially resisted the idea. Sitting across from a stranger and baring my soul felt unnatural, but over time it became a vital part of my healing process. Ted, Arnie, and I occasionally met for beers, our shared experiences forging an unlikely camaraderie. Arnie seemed determined to salvage his marriage, bending Hannah to his conditions with an iron resolve. Ted, however, was torn between his love for Amy and the fresh start Chicago promised. As for me, I had no interest in looking back. Molly's pleas, delivered through texts and emails I refused to read, were as meaningless as her promises of fidelity. One day, while clearing out my inbox, I stumbled upon an email from Molly's father, Donald. It was short and devoid of the usual pleasantries. He expressed disappointment in his daughter's behavior and extended an apology on behalf of their family. Strangely, his words didn't bring me comfort. They felt like an empty gesture, a formality rather than genuine remorse. I responded politely but succinctly, making it clear that I wished to sever all ties with their family. Barbara and I eventually grew closer, though I remained cautious. My trust, once boundless, now came with conditions and walls. She seemed to understand, never pushing for more than I could give. On one rainy evening, after a quiet dinner at her place, she asked me if I could ever love again. Her question lingered in the air, heavy with uncertainty. My answer was honest but hesitant. I want to, I really do, but it's going to take time. The months turned into a year, and gradually I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self. I moved into a new apartment, one filled with art and light, a reflection of the person I was becoming. My relationships, both old and new, felt more authentic, no longer shadowed by the weight of Molly's deception. I even reconnected with Dave, my college roommate, who reminded me that life wasn't just about romantic love, but also about friendships and shared laughter. By the time Molly's name ceased to sting, Barbara and I had built something solid. She wasn't my rebound or a replacement. She was my partner, Someone who stood by me not despite my past, but because she understood its significance. Our love was different from what I'd had with Molly. Quieter and steadier, but perhaps that was exactly what I needed. Looking back now, I see my time with Molly as a painful but necessary chapter in my life. Her betrayal taught me hard truths about trust, boundaries, and self-worth. It also gave me the strength to walk away from what no longer served me and to embrace a future I hadn't imagined. Life, I've learned, is messy and unpredictable, but it's also filled with second chances, and this time I intend to get it right.